Even at 26, the memory of that night when I was 12 remains vivid. My parents had left me under the supervision of my 18-year-old brother Zach. He decided to sneak out with friends, swearing me to secrecy, an easy promise to keep since the idea of having the entire house to myself felt like total freedom. However, my excitement soon turned to unease. I made the mistake of watching a horror movie while alone for the first time at night. By the middle of the film, I was thoroughly spooked. It wasn't just the movie. Every normal house sound, the creaking floors, the wind, and the hum of the refrigerator, set me on edge. I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder at the stairs, terrified that someone was watching me from the shadows. Eventually, the fear became too much to handle. Realizing it was foolish to keep scaring myself, I shut off the TV and sprinted upstairs to my room, driven by that childish instinct that something is chasing you the moment the lights go out. I hurried into the Jack and Jill bathroom that connected my room to my parents', brushed my teeth as quickly as possible, and tried to settle my nerves. To distract myself, I fired up Call of Duty Zombies on my Xbox 360. The game worked. I lost myself in the gameplay for hours, the fear finally fading into the background. It wasn't until my team finally lost the match that I snapped back to reality. Feeling frustrated by the game and realizing how late it had become, I decided it was finally time to go to bed. Not long after, I felt the vibration of the front door closing and assumed Zach had finally returned. However, as I lay there, the sounds from downstairs grew unsettling. Instead of heading straight to his room as usual, someone was lingering, making subtle thuds and indistinguishable noises that made my stomach churn. My anxiety from the movie spiked again. I peered out the window to confirm it was him, but his car was nowhere to be seen. True panic took hold. At 12 years old, I didn't have a cell phone. The only way to call for help was to use a landline downstairs, which felt like a death sentence. After quietly ensuring my bedroom door was locked, though I knew the flimsy lock could be easily picked, I realized I needed a better hiding spot. I squeezed into the cramped crawl space closet built into my wall, pulled the door shut, and prayed I was just being paranoid. I desperately hoped Zach had simply parked on the street. My hope vanished when I heard someone fumbling with my bedroom door. It swung open, and I listened, paralyzed, as an intruder moved through my room. I could hear the floorboards creaking under their weight and the sound of my belongings being shifted around. Every second felt like an eternity as I sat in the dark, certain that if that closet door opened, I wouldn't survive the night. And a few moments later, he came into my room and called my name again. I stepped out of the closet and the first thing he did was yell at me, asking what I was doing in there, and what I had done to his room. It was this moment that confirmed to me that it was in fact not my brother who was in the house. That I explained the situation as quickly as I could, still shaking and unable to stop my hands from trembling. Once he understood, we both got up and started looking around the house together. That's when we realized how bad it really was. Drawers had been pulled out. Some of our electronics were missing, including TVs and gaming consoles. It was clear someone had been through the house and had taken things that were valuable. Zach immediately called the police, knowing that this was serious, and we waited together, still on edge, checking doors and windows to make sure nothing else was taken. The police came and made a report, writing down everything that was missing and asking us questions about what happened. They told us they would investigate, and that we should wait for our parents to get home. Around 4 a.m., our parents arrived. My dad was furious and went straight for Zach, smacking him square in the face for being such a careless idiot. Not only leaving me alone, but leaving the front door unlocked. My mom checked on me, gave me a hug, and told me she was just glad I was safe. Zach was forced to pay monthly rent from that point on to slowly pay back for all the things that were stolen and treated with extreme caution after that night. I, on the other hand, was not punished at all. I was just shaken up, terrified of what had happened. And the whole experience stuck with me for years. Every time I thought about it, I could feel the fear all over again, remembering hiding in that closet and hearing someone walking around my room, not knowing if I would make it out alive. It was by far the scariest experience of my life, and it has stayed with me even now. Around 4 a.m., our parents arrived. My dad was furious and went straight for Zach, smacking him square in the face for being such a careless idiot. Not only leaving me alone, but leaving the front door unlocked. My mom checked on me, gave me a hug, and told me she was just glad I was safe. Zach was forced to pay monthly rent from that point on to slowly pay back for all the things that were stolen and treated with extreme caution after that night. I, on the other hand, was not punished at all. I was just shaken up, terrified of what had happened. And the whole experience stuck with me for years. Every time I thought about it, I could feel the fear all over again, remembering hiding in that closet and hearing someone walking around my room, not knowing if I would make it out alive. It was by far the scariest experience of my life, and it has stayed with me even now. Before I was even old enough for kindergarten, I lived with my grandparents following my parents' separation. It was a bustling household. Between my grandparents and my uncle, I was rarely ever by myself. We lived in a tight-knit, peaceful town where neighbors were like family. One neighbor in particular, David, was a constant presence. He was a fixture at our family barbecues, watched sports with my uncle, and helped my grandpa with everything from yard work to hauling moose into the shed after a hunt. One evening, I found myself alone for the first time. My grandmother was at bingo and needed a ride home. My grandpa offered to take me along, but I was too engrossed in my cartoons to leave. Before heading out, he gave me the standard warning: "Don't open the door for anyone." The house felt unnervingly silent the moment his truck pulled out of the driveway. Only a few minutes passed before there was a knock at the door. Remembering my grandpa's rule, I called out to ask who it was. I was immediately relieved to hear a familiar voice on the other side. It was David. I explained that my grandparents were out, but David already knew. He mentioned seeing my grandfather drive away. When I added that my uncle was also gone, he claimed he'd just spoken to him and knew he was out drinking. David then asked to come inside. Though I remembered the rule about not opening the door for strangers, he argued that since he was a neighbor I knew well, the rule didn't apply. Convinced by his logic but confused as to why he wanted to visit an empty house, I unlocked the door. David loomed over me, visibly intoxicated, swaying, slurring his words, and squinting. As he stepped inside, he gripped my shoulders. Because I was used to seeing my uncle drink, I wasn't immediately frightened. I simply suggested he wait in the kitchen while I finished my cartoons. However, he refused to release his grip. When I tried to pry his hands off me, I realized I couldn't move them. His tone shifted abruptly, turning sharp and angry. He began saying things that terrified me, and while the specific words have faded from my memory, the fear they instilled remains vivid. He forced me into the kitchen, grabbed a large knife, and pressed the tip against my stomach, asking if I wanted to be stabbed. When I started to cry, he threatened to cut out my tongue or slit my throat if I didn't shut up, even dragging the dull side of the blade across my neck to prove he meant it. Suddenly, the sound of my grandparents' truck pulling into the driveway broke the silence. I heard the car doors slam, and just as I prepared to scream for help, David clamped his hand over my mouth to silence me. He turned us both toward the door exactly as my grandmother walked in. The smile on her face disappeared instantly when she saw David holding me at knife point, and she shrieked for my grandfather to get inside immediately. My grandfather burst into the house, his voice exploding in a mix of shock and fury. The moment he saw David holding me hostage, he charged with a level of pure rage that forced David to shove me to the floor and let go. My grandmother instantly scooped me up, shielding me with her body and whispering that I was safe so I wouldn't have to witness the violence. I could hear the sounds of the struggle until my grandfather finally overpowered him. He physically threw David out of the house, shouting for him to never return before slamming the door shut. As I matured, the sinister reality of that night became clear. David hadn't just stumbled over. He had been watching. He waited until he knew my uncle was out, my grandmother was at bingo, and my grandfather had driven away. He had calculated his moment perfectly. While I was too young then to understand his dark intentions, the gravity of the event stayed with me. Years later, following my grandfather's funeral, I sat with my grandmother and revisited that night, reflecting on just how heroic he truly was. My grandmother's expression clouded with unease as she recalled the terror of that night. When I mentioned my grandfather leaving later that evening to go hunting, she claimed her memory of his departure was fuzzy. It struck me as odd. He rarely went hunting at night unless he was on an extended camping trip. Reflecting on it now, the pieces began to fit together in a chilling way. My family never contacted the police or pressed charges, yet I never saw David again. My grandfather was a pillar of the community, a devout churchgoer, and a close friend to several local officers. He was a skilled hunter, the kind of man no one would ever suspect or question, even if they saw him driving out of town late at night with a blood-stained tarp in the back of his truck. In the spring of 2020, back when I was 15, I was home alone while my parents were away for the week. Out of the blue, I received a call from a school acquaintance named Mason. We weren't particularly close, so the call was unexpected. Before I could even greet him, Mason cut to the chase, asking what I was up to. I told him I was just relaxing at home. He then asked if he could drop off a mutual friend of ours, my longtime buddy, Neil, claiming Neil needed a place to crash for the night. Initially, I declined. I was looking forward to some solitary downtime and didn't want the responsibility of company. However, Mason's tone shifted to one of pure desperation. He practically begged me to take Neil in, his voice filled with an urgency I couldn't quite place. Seeing my hesitation, he finally offered a bribe. If I agreed to let Neil stay, he'd let me use his weed pen. That incentive was enough to make me cave, and I told them to come over. Looking back, I realize how foolish it was to let a bribe like that cloud my judgment, but at 15, I wasn't exactly making the best decisions. I should have taken the warnings more seriously. The week before, my brother and several friends had mentioned that Neil, who was already an eccentric, filterless guy, had started behaving erratically in class. My brother described him bursting into random fits of laughter or clapping in the middle of a silent room. Even more concerning were the bizarre things he'd say. He apparently claimed the school basketball coaches were Freemasons attempting to recruit him. I knew then that Neil was spiraling, but the true extent of his breakdown didn't hit me until the moment he and Mason actually pulled up to my house. I greeted Mason and Neil at the door as if it were a normal visit. After taking the promised hit from Mason's weed pen, I watched as a strange, heavy tension settled over them. Mason gripped Neil's shoulders with tears welling in his eyes, begging him not to do that thing. Neil just gave him a hollow, casual nod of understanding. I should have pressed for an explanation right then, but I stayed silent and let Neil inside as Mason drove away. The second the door closed, Neil's first question was whether every entrance to the house was locked. Red flags immediately went up. I knew I'd made a massive mistake. To appease his growing intensity, I led him through the narrow hallway to prove the laundry room and back doors were secured. After I confirmed we were locked in, he fell into an eerie silence, and we just stood there in the quiet of the house. Without warning, Neil's arm shot into the air as if he were raising his hand in class, and he flashed an eerie, white-toothed grin that I can still see vividly today. He held that pose for several agonizing seconds before dropping his arm in total silence. I tried to break the tension with a forced laugh, hoping to normalize the moment, but the atmosphere only grew darker. When we went to the kitchen to get him some water, I noticed him hovering by the silverware drawer. My heart stopped as he slowly pulled it open and reached for a steak knife. Instinct took over. I lunged forward, grabbed his hand, and slammed the drawer shut before he could grip the weapon. Neil didn't flinch. He just stared at me and let out a chilling chuckle, as if he were trying to play the whole thing off as a joke. At that point, pure, primal terror set in, the kind where your heart thumps in your ears and your body freezes. I realized then that my life was in genuine danger, and my only goal was to get him out of the house. Finally, he broke the silence by suggesting we head to a nearby neighborhood park. I played along, acting as if nothing was wrong. As we headed toward the laundry room exit, I made sure to let him step out first, claiming I needed a moment to put on my shoes. I saw a flash of disappointment on his face as he told me to hurry up, but the moment he was outside, I slammed the door and bolted every lock. I immediately called my brother, frantically explaining the situation. In a state of high alert, and admittedly a bit clouded by the weed, I gathered every single knife in the kitchen and hauled them up to my bedroom, determined to make sure Neil couldn't use them if he managed to get back inside. My brother and 3 of his friends arrived in record time, intercepting Neil in the driveway. When I finally found the courage to step outside, I found Neil in the middle of a delusional rant, claiming the school basketball coaches were part of the Illuminati and were abusing players to improve their performance. He continued to spiral into nonsense for several minutes. We realized he was completely detached from reality, and I made it clear there was no way he was stepping foot back in my house. We had to get him home immediately. Eventually, one of my friends drove Neil home, despite his terrified protests that his father was going to kill him. Seeking answers, I called Mason to find out what had happened during their drive. Mason revealed a horrifying detail. Neil had been reading aloud from a manifesto, claiming he had to kill himself or someone else to save his own life. Panicked and desperate to offload the danger, Mason had simply dumped Neil on me. I was furious that he would put me in such a life-threatening situation without a word of warning, though I also blamed myself for not asking more questions earlier. It was later discovered that Neil had ingested substances that triggered a severe schizophrenic break, causing him to hear voices and spiral into psychosis. When I finally told my mother about that night a month later, she was beyond horrified. Looking back, I realize I narrowly escaped a tragedy. If I hadn't stayed alert the moment he walked in, and if I hadn't intercepted him in the kitchen, that night would have ended in a nightmare.